Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another gathering with the folks from the Reformed Church Center. Today is the last of three colloquies we've had talking about creation in terms of care, communion, and consummation. And today we'll talk about a little more about how advocacy shows up in Scripture and how we can be practicing it ourselves, and more information on that. So I'm glad you can all be here with us. We are pleased to welcome the group that has been taking us through all of these creation care discussions. Today, our principal speaker is Kyle Myers-Skop, who's Executive Director of the Association for a More Just Society, US. He holds degrees from Calvin University and Western Seminary and is a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. For the last 10 years, he has educated and mobilized Christians around the world to address the climate crisis as an act of discipleship and neighbor love. Josh Parks is here as a PhD student in religious studies at the University of Virginia. He also has a degree from Calvin, and along with degrees from Western Michigan University and a nice little startup seminary that's about 17 miles down the road from New Brunswick. I always like to remind my friends who live and work in Princeton that they have the honor of being the second oldest seminary in New Jersey.
Fair enough.
And so, no, we truly do love the folks at Princeton. His current research is on religion and the Walt Disney Company. And he's interested in the role of medievalism, fantasy, and wonder in American religion. Is working on a biography of Walt Disney that will be published by Erdman's in their Library of Religious Biography series. He's also a violinist and is available to play for worship services and chamber groups and orchestras. Having been a musician myself, Josh, I know that new gigs are always welcome. So
definitely.
Renee House is a former faculty member here at New Brunswick and recently retired from full-time ministry at Old Dutch Reformed Church in Kingston, New York. She was here on the faculty for 25 years, and again, aged not a day while working at New Brunswick. It was all Kingston that did it to her. She continues to work in Kingston in local congregations for the Mid-Hudson Classis and the Regional Synod of New York, and with the Kingston Interfaith Council and the Kingston Coalition for Housing Justice, which she helped to create. And Deb Rienstra is here. We say our prayers at the right time and everybody appears who's supposed to appear. Deb is professor of English at Calvin University, specializing in early British literature and creative writing. She's the author of 4 books on motherhood, spirituality, worship, and eco-theology and climate change, as well as numerous essays and poems and all sorts of good things. Her most recent book is Refugee of Faith, Seeking Hidden Shelters, Ordinary Wonders, and the Healing of the Earth, and was published by Fortress in 2022. So I'm sure you can find it on Amazon and all those other good things. Tom Bogart is Dennis and Betty Lou Voskuil Chair of Old Testament Emeritus at Western Seminary and a General Synod Professor of Theology in Emeritus, General Synod Professor of Theology Emeritus, and is also another valuable writer in all of this. Welcome,
Thank
Tom.
you.
So go ahead, Kyle.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James, for the opportunity to share what I have to share today. So what I want to talk about today is we've had a couple of colloquies so far that have laid a beautiful, rich foundation for a theology of creation care. I want to shift us a little bit today into practice. I am a practitioner, an activist. This is where I like to live. So I'm excited to share some of this with you today. And I'm calling my presentation today, Loving Our Neighbors in Public. And I'll share a little bit in a moment what I mean by that. But I want to start with a Bible verse. I'm a pastor. Seems appropriate. From Matthew 22, Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. I think many of us are likely familiar with the context for this teaching from Jesus. He's asked by a teacher of the law, what is the greatest commandment? The passage itself tells us this is a test, which is fascinating, and we could have a whole conversation about that. But I want to start here because this is the grounding for what I want to talk about today. Jesus tells us himself that all of the law and the prophets, every law in the Old Testament, all more than 600 of them, can be boiled down to love God with everything you got and love your neighbor as if their current circumstances and future prospects were your own. And that's what leads me to this conclusion. That's going to be the foundation for what I want to share today. That in a warming world, climate action is Christian discipleship. In a warming world, climate action and caring for creation is part of what it means to follow Jesus. And I want to talk about one particular kind of action today. There's all kinds of ways that we can take action to address climate change, to care for creation, to remediate pollution. But I want to share one action that I want to offer for you today, and that's advocacy. I'm going to share what I mean by the word advocacy, because I think we all have a sense of what that means, but I want to coalesce around a shared definition. But first, I want to share just a quick history lesson around environmental policy in the US in modern history, the last 50 years or so, because I think it's important for us to understand the context that we're living in as it relates to environmental policy and the work that we can do to advocate for environmental policy on behalf of our neighbors. So a brief history. This is a picture of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, runs through Cleveland. Many of you might know that the Cuyahoga River started on fire in 1969, and that was one of the sparks that ignited the global movement in 1970 that we know as Earth Day. Obviously, it wasn't the only reason, but it was one of the instigating reasons that movement sparked and ignited and resulted in millions of people taking to the streets, calling on their leaders to address environmental pollution and degradation. What you might not know is that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire more than that one time. It's believed that the Cuyahoga River caught fire 14 times between the start of the Industrial Revolution in 1969. The Cuyahoga River has not started on fire since. And here are some of the reasons why. Because that outpouring, that active advocacy and ongoing advocacy that we saw in Earth Day and all of the efforts that unfurled from it led to some pretty significant successes as it relates to environmental policy change in the United States. I want to share just a brief history of what some of those are. The first one I'm going to share is pre-1970, but it's still really, really important. The Clean Air Act in 1963 did a great deal to clean up pollutants and other toxins in the air that we breathe. Really important foundational piece of environmental policy passed in 1963. After Earth Day and the outrage from the Cuyahoga River starting on fire and the advocacy to address environmental pollution, NEPA was passed, the National Environmental Policy Act in 1970. This is kind of the landmark foundational law upon which a whole bunch of subsequent environmental law and policy has been built. It is the bedrock of the majority of environmental policy that exists today. One of the things that it did, among many others, was it created the Presidential Council on Environmental Quality, and it housed for the first time a body focused on monitoring environmental quality in the executive branch. Also in 1970, a little agency you might have heard of called the Environmental Protection Agency was founded, the EPA, which has gone on to promulgate countless regulations and standards that have done significant good for the health of Americans and people all around the world. The Clean Water Act, 1972, addressing things like how is a river allowed to start on fire? What are we dumping into our waterways? And how can we clean them up? In 1970 and 1990, there were major amendments made to the Clean Air Act of 1963 that made it stronger and more robust. In 1987, the world got together and said, hey, we have a problem. There's this thing in our atmosphere called the ozone that protects us from the UV rays of the sun, and it is degrading alarmingly. What are we going to do about it? So the world got together and they said, well, we know what's causing it. It's chlorofluorocarbons, which are refrigerants used in air conditioners, refrigerators, freezers, even aerosol cans like hairspray and spray on deodorant. And the world found the political will to phase down CFCs. They replaced them with hydrofluorocarbons, which don't deplete the ozone, but are potent greenhouse gases. Oops. I will share in a minute what the world is doing now to address that mistake. But still, that happened in 1987. It was a really big deal. And in 1992, the world got together in Rio de Janeiro and said, hey, we have another problem. It's called global warming. What are we going to do about it? And one of the things that resulted from the Rio Earth Summit was the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the umbrella group under which exists things like the COP, the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC, which you'll likely hear about on the news every November, December, when they gather somewhere around the world to chart a common way forward to address climate change. Really quick overview. I wonder if you saw a pattern, particularly in any of these dates. Look at these dates and tell me if you notice a pattern among all of these landmark environmental policy wins, except for the 1963 Clean Air Act. You can put it in the chat. You can raise your hand if you want to. Who was president in 1970? Who was president in 1987? Who was president in 1992? And what party were they from? I know you guys know this. This is like the Sunday school. The answer is Jesus. Just put it in the chat. You know it. So 1970 was Richard Nixon, as was 1972. 1990, George H.W. Bush. 1987, Ronald Reagan. That's right. 1992, George H.W. Bush again. Kent got it. All Republicans. All of these landmark pieces of legislation were passed under Republican administrations, except for the Clean Air Act. That was Kennedy. But that's important because that's not necessarily the case today. I want to show you a time capsule to make my point that the environment did not used to be partisan. And I would argue it need not be partisan now. I'm going to show you a quick video and we'll talk about it.
Hi, I'm Nancy Pelosi, lifelong Democrat and Speaker of the House.
And I'm Newt Gingrich, lifelong Republican, and I used to be Speaker.
We don't always see eye to eye, do we, Newt?
No, but we do agree our country must take action to address climate change.
We need cleaner forms of energy, and we need them fast.
If enough of us demand action from our leaders, we can spark the innovation we need.
Go to wecansolveit.org. Together, we can do this.
Okay. Together, we can do this, say Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich about climate change. Lest you think that was ancient history, that was filmed in 2009, soon after Nancy Pelosi had gained the gavel. In 2009, Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich both believed that it was in their political best interest to sit on a couch together and say, we agree about climate change. That always surprises me every time I show that video, that in 2009, still, there was political consensus that climate change was a problem and we had to do something about it. Now, important things have happened since 2009, and we could spend another presentation talking about what has happened since to create such significant partisan division around climate change. But what I want you to recognize now is that that partisan rancor and division is only 15 years old. Obviously, it was building in 2009. It didn't just happen after 2009, but 15 years ago, there was still an opportunity for a bipartisan PSA like that. And lest you believe that some of these environmental policy solutions have only been accomplished since 1990 and before, right? I want to share some more recent policy successes just really quickly that didn't necessarily make the headlines, but are important and major. In 2020, the Energy Act was passed on a bipartisan basis. I'll say all of these were passed in a bipartisan basis. The Energy Act did a lot of things, but fundamentally what it did was it created a comprehensive energy innovation roadmap for the country. In essence, this bill, which an Energy Act had not been passed for years before this, what this bill did was it said, we know that renewable energy is the future, and we know that America has to get there. We disagree about how we're going to get there, maybe even how quickly we have to get there, but we agree that we do have to get there eventually. And it created a roadmap, incentives, subsidies, tax credits to incentivize that transition. Also in 2020, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act. This addressed that issue that I talked about earlier of hydrofluorocarbons. And it sought to reduce hydrofluorocarbons in the US by 85% by 2035. That's a really big deal because it's estimated that if we can phase out hydrofluorocarbons completely from the atmosphere, we will avert a 0.5 degree Celsius by 2100. That's a lot, right? I mean, we're talking about trying to reduce warming by 2100 by a couple of degrees Celsius. If we can get a 0.5 degree just by phasing out these chemicals, that's a major success. You might have heard of the Infrastructure Innovation and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill in 2021. Hundreds of billions of dollars have already gone out to tens of thousands of projects across every state, and hundreds of billion dollars are left to go out as well. And a lot of this infrastructure and innovation is around clean energy. It's around resilient infrastructure, helping communities adapt and be resilient to climate impacts. The Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. This is the world getting together in Kigali, Rwanda, a couple of years ago and saying, yeah, we messed up in Montreal. We replaced CFCs with HFCs. HFCs are also a problem, but we as a global community are going to work to phase down HFCs. That was ratified in a bipartisan vote by the Senate, 69-27. Global treaties don't get ratified by the US Senate like anymore. It rarely happens. And to get a ratification with that kind of bipartisan vote, that's a big deal. In 2022, the CHIPS and Science Act. This was in response to the semiconductor shortage that we experienced coming out of COVID lockdowns when the economy was ramping back up. But something else that it did was it invested billions of dollars in advanced research to accelerate zero carbon technological innovation. And I'm assuming a lot of you have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act was not passed in a bipartisan fashion. It was passed with Democratic votes, but it is the single largest investment in clean energy in US history. $359 billion allocated to clean energy investment and acceleration. Among its many provisions, a 30% per year tax credit to homeowners for energy efficiency upgrades. That's a huge deal if you own a home and you want to make it more efficient. And something that's really cool that I tell churches when I present to churches is that oftentimes these incentives for clean energy spending and retrofitting are often built into the tax code. And if you're a nonprofit like New Brunswick Theological Seminary or a church, you don't pay taxes. So you can't benefit from a tax credit in the tax code. But the Inflation Reduction Act created direct pay provisions. This is where the federal government will essentially cut a check to nonprofits and say, we're going to cover X% of your investment in clean energy. If you want to put solar panels on your roof as a nonprofit, You have to do the work to make sure you're jumping through the hoops the federal government requires. But if you do, you'll get a check to help you pay for that, anywhere from 30 to 50% of total project costs. And really quickly, if you're a homeowner and you're curious what kind of benefits there might be for you to make upgrades to your home, I highly recommend Rewiring America, and the URL's at the bottom there. It's a really handy tool where you just enter a few pieces of information and it spits out all of the provisions that you are eligible for, how to access them. Really, really cool tool that I highly recommend. We can send that around after too, potentially, if you don't get a chance to capture that URL now. Here's the summary. Just the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, all passed in the last couple of years. Just those three together, they're going to triple annual federal spending on climate and clean energy compared to the 2010s. That is a huge deal. And to me, I don't think this gets enough press. I think if you ask the average person on the street, even someone who's concerned about climate change, you're going to hear, oh, Congress isn't doing anything. Policy is a waste of time. Advocacy is a waste of time. My voice doesn't matter. This stands in direct contradiction to that. There has been significant progress just in the last few years toward investing in clean energy solutions and transitioning our economy to a clean energy future. Certainly not enough, but a lot has been done. Okay, I want to move faster because I'm afraid I'm already going to run out of time. But really quickly, there remains a lot of policy opportunities for us to engage in. One of them is the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill is a massive piece of legislation that has to be passed every 5 years, has to be renewed every 5 years. The bulk of it is nutritional assistance. So SNAP benefits, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, used to be food stamps, as well as crop insurance for farmers. But a not small portion of it is conservation funding. There is $6 billion included in last year's Farm Bill that goes toward conservation funding every year to help farmers do what farmers already know how to do and want to do, which is take care of their land. The IRA, actually, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed a couple years ago, allocated almost $20 billion over 5 years toward these conservation programs out of a recognition that that $6 billion a year is not enough. But that needs to be locked in because it's possible that when the new Farm Bill is passed, which they're currently negotiating now, that will be clawed back. Another interesting opportunity is something called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. This is pretty wonky. Essentially, what it is taxes on imports from other countries that want to send their goods to our market to be bought and sold. A tax that correlates with the amount of greenhouse gases that were emitted during the manufacturing process for that good. It's a tariff, a carbon tariff. This has been put in place already in Europe, and it's moving through the World Trade Organization right now, and experts are pretty confident it's going to stand up to the scrutiny of the WTO, and it's going to be allowed to be put in place. You can imagine what kind of incentive it creates, for instance, for a country like China, who imports hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods to the United States every year, if suddenly they need to pay a tariff on all of their imports because of the greenhouse gases that went into the production of those goods. You can imagine how quickly they might work then to clean up their supply chain to make sure that their products are clean, so they don't have to pay that extra tariff. If the US could implement something like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, it would trigger a significant signal to the global market that it's in the economic best interest of countries to have clean supply chains that do not emit greenhouse gases. And finally, the EPA, we talked about them already. There are roughly 20 new standards that are going to be promulgated in the next couple of years. That's a bit out of date. This, I should say, new standards that the Biden administration is sprinting to try to put in place before potentially a new administration takes over after this year. Things like soot, which are really harmful to human health and come from tailpipes and smokestacks. Carbon, ozone, ground level ozone is really harmful to human health. All kinds of standards and regulations that are really, really important for the environment and for humans that we have an opportunity to support and to speak into. Okay, so that's some history and the current moment with some opportunities that are currently before us. But how do we actually turn these kinds of opportunities into a reality? I would argue advocacy is how citizens can participate in the process to turn these opportunities into reality. So what is advocacy, right? I think we all have a working definition of it. I pulled some definitions from like Webster's, very boring. The act of speaking on behalf of or in support of another person, place, or thing, public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy, an activity by an individual or group that aims to influence decisions within political, economic, and social institutions. All of that I would boil down to say advocacy for Christians is the act of loving our neighbors in public. It's how we act in public to try to put into action Jesus's words to love God and to love our neighbor. So why should Christians in particular engage in advocacy? There are robust Christian traditions that have rejected political advocacy as part of the purview of the Christian life. I respect that. I disagree with it, but I respect it. Here's why I believe that Christians have a duty to engage in advocacy as an act of public neighbor love. And the first reason why I believe that's the case is that it's faithful. Scripture shouts God's heart for justice and God's desire that his people do justice in the world. I'm not going to read all of these, but hopefully just showing you will help you get a sense of the breadth, and this is not exhaustive. Isaiah, of course, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless. Psalms, also full of these commands, defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, right? We're seeing in these injunctions the lifting up of some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in ancient Israelite society, right? Those without a father, those without a husband to provide for them, the poor, the oppressed. James, he doesn't mince words. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If you say, go and I wish you well, keep warm and well fed, but do nothing to meet his physical needs, what good is it? James later has a word for faith that sees somebody in need and does nothing to address it. He calls that faith dead. In other words, the Holy Spirit is not in it. Proverbs, also similar to the Psalms and Isaiah. Micah 6:8, we all know this passage, right? We named our second son Amos, partly because I love this prophet and his message. He says, I hate your religious festivals and your worship songs. Perhaps for us, he might say, I hate your preaching. I hate your worship conferences. I plug up my ears when you sing your new songs. That's not what I want. I don't want any of that. I want justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. In Isaiah, too, the people of Israel are saying, we're fasting. We're doing everything that you told us to do, God. And God says, that's not what I want. You're not truly fasting because your fasting is covering up. It's papering over the systemic injustice in society, in Israelite society. The kind of fasting I want is for you to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke and set the oppressed free. And of course, in Luke, Jesus quotes Isaiah, and he inaugurates his mission by saying, this is my mission statement. God has sent me to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. In other words, I believe Jesus is essentially saying, if my ministry here on earth doesn't look like this, if it doesn't result in things that are good for people who are poor, for prisoners, for the blind, for the oppressed, then I will have failed. And I think by extension, the same can be true of us. If our ministry in Jesus' name does not result in these things, then we have failed. And of course, the passage we've already looked at, when Jesus says, everything can be boiled down to this: love God and love your neighbor. Cornel West is a theologian, an activist, presidential candidate now, who says that justice is what love looks like in public. I really like that. And because I am just audacious enough to improve on Cornel West's words, I would add that if justice is what love looks like in public, then advocacy is how we love in public. If we want to love in public, we have to engage in advocacy. It is faithful to our scriptures. It's our heritage, too. We see not only instruction in scripture, we see examples. Esther advocates on behalf of her people to save them from Haman's plan. She succeeds. Paul advocates at the Council of Jerusalem for the inclusion of Gentiles in the Jesus way. And I, for one, am really glad that he did that and that he succeeded so that we can be included in the story of what Jesus is doing in the world. Moses advocated on behalf of the Israelites to God himself, and he changed God's mind. I'm really interested to hear what Tom has to say about that. Nehemiah advocates in exile to go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and he not only gets permission, he gets funding. Job advocates for himself, right? He says, God, you have not held up your end of the covenant bargain. I've done everything you've asked. Explain yourself. And Jesus, of course, advocates for the woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery. He advocates for those who are poor and oppressed, and he advocates for us now, sitting at the right hand of God the Father. And it's not just in scripture. We have tons of examples in present day of Christians engaging in public advocacy as an act of Christian discipleship, as an act of neighbor love. William Wilberforce, a member of England's parliament, was a staunch leader in the abolitionist movement to abolish the Atlantic slave trade. He said, a private faith that does not act in the face of oppression is no faith at all. His faith as an Anglican is what drove him to that work. Anybody know who this guy is? You can throw it in the chat or raise your electronic hand and take a guess. This is the section where I ask you guys to engage. So just so you know, be ready with that chat window. Be brave, throw out some ideas. Who do you think this guy is? Yeah, Ellen, nice work. This is John Brown. So John Brown was a abolitionist who lived in the United States, who engaged in violent insurrection. He armed slaves and led armed slave rebellions. He was most famous for the rebellion at Harper's Ferry in West Virginia. I am not advocating violence. That's not why I include John Brown here. I include John Brown here because he was a Baptist, and he writes about how his faith led him to look out at the repugnant demonic evil of chattel slavery in the United States. And it drove him to say, this cannot stand. Something must be done. And he decided that violence was justified to address it. But it was his faith that led him to do that. Anybody know who any of these women are? Or perhaps not their names. Given their dress and the look of their portraits and photographs, what issue do you think they were engaged in? Yeah, Maria. Suffrage. Here's what I want to share. I always, if I'm not in presenter view, I have such a hard time remembering each of their names. So I'm going to do my best. In fact, I'm just going to do this. So left to right, we have Anna Howard Shaw. In the middle is Antoinette Brown Blackwell. And on the right is Olympia Brown. And why I want to share them as examples. Now I can't find my mouse. Okay, there we go. Why I want to share them as examples for activists for suffrage, which many of you got right, is because none of them started as activists for suffrage. All of them started as activists to gain access to the pulpit. They were preachers. None of them were allowed to preach. All of them advocated inside of their tradition to gain access to the pulpit, and all of them did. And as they stood in their pulpit, preaching the word of God, they looked out at society and said, we can't stop here. We can't stay here when our sisters might have access to the pulpit, but they don't even have access to the ballot box. So they took their activism outside of the church and they took it to the streets for women's suffrage. But again, it was their faith that drove them to look at women being excluded from public life and to say, that's not right. We have to take action. I think a lot of us know who this guy might be. This is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor and a theologian, German pastor and theologian, who found himself in Harlem, New York, as the Third Reich was rising back in Germany, and he could have stayed. He could have stayed in the US. He could have avoided Hitler's Germany, but he went back. He said, I can't remain silent. I have to go back and I have to fight. He was imprisoned in a concentration camp and executed not long before that camp was liberated by Allied forces. But again, it was his faith that drove him to act. Does anybody know what we're looking at here? What movement is this? What leader led this movement? If you look behind you, there's a clue. It's a field of something. I'll give you a hint. It's a field of grapes. Not Hugo Chavez. Close. Cesar Chavez. Yes. Yeah, so this is the United Farm Workers Movement. Yep, you guys got it. Nice job. The United Farm Workers Movement, activists mobilizing for the rights of farm workers across the US who were exposed to, interestingly enough, environmental toxins, harmful pesticides and herbicides that were making them sick. One of their tactics was pilgrimage, walking from one city to another, and as they did, getting media attention. But pilgrimage is a spiritual practice, right? That's a practice taken from the church. Pilgrims are believers who go on a journey to explore their faith, to better understand their relationship with Jesus, to encounter Christ in the journey. These people were taking tactics from the church and using it to advocate for the rights of farm workers. One of the reasons is because Cesar Chavez was a deeply committed Catholic. At the head of all of their pilgrimages was this banner. If you look closely, you can see who it is. That's Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Virgin Mary, led the way on all of their pilgrimages. And at each of their stops was a shrine to the Virgin. They prayed, they fasted together. This movement was a deeply Christian movement. Anybody know who this is? She was also Catholic. Yeah, Renee.
Dorothy Day.
Yep. Dorothy Day. A couple people got it in the chat too. Dorothy Day started the Catholic worker movement, a movement committed to social justice within the Catholic Church. And this guy, I think we all know who that guy is. Martin Luther. We don't really think of Martin Luther as an activist or an advocate, but that's exactly what he was. His 95 Theses were a movement, what was kind of the opening shot in a movement that drove his whole life, a movement for reform. Martin Luther never set out to create the Protestant church, right? He was a Catholic, and it was his love for the church that drove him to call it out when he thought it was failing. He was an activist and an advocate too. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., the Southern Leadership Council. And I love this picture because of the people standing next to him. Clerical collars, right? We see priests, clergy. He was himself a Baptist preacher. The civil rights movement was infused with Christian faith and Christian ideals. I think a lot of times, especially around climate change, I often hear accusations of action as like some sort of performative wokeism or just like liberal progressivism and partisan politics, when in fact, advocating for justice is deeply Christian, right? We saw all of the admonitions throughout Scripture for God's love of justice and his call for us to do justice. We saw examples of our heroes of the faith in Scripture that lived that out, and examples all the way up to now of how Christians are living out their faith in this way. And in fact, it's not an addition to the gospel. It has always been a faithful expression of the gospel in the world. So it's faithful. Advocacy is faithful. It's our heritage. It's also necessary. When we talk about things like climate change, we're talking about systemic problems that require a systemic solution. Climate change is the sum total of all of the laws and the policies and the jurisprudence that have been built around basic questions of how to organize our society. Questions like, how are we going to heat and cool and light our homes? How are we going to get ourselves from point A to point B? How are we going to grow and ship and sell our food? All of those questions have been answered by fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have been the answer, right? From the internal combustion engine to fossil fuel powered electricity generation to industrial agriculture that's powered by fossil fuels. In other words, policy has created the conditions in which the world could warm by answering all of these questions, by saying fossil fuels are how we're going to answer these questions. And we're going to need policy, new policy, to bring the temperature down again. It's not going to be enough for us to sow a vegetable patch in our backyard and to take shorter showers and to eat less meat and to fly less often, even though these are all important and necessary things for us to do, especially as Christians. It is not sufficient. We must also engage in the process of crafting new public policy, because if we truly want to love our neighbor, we have to do that privately through all of those choices and publicly through advocacy. So how do we actually do advocacy? I'm just going to wrap this up, and then I'm very eager to have a conversation about this. There are all kinds of shapes that advocacy can take. I'm going to commend to you one of those forms today, but here are just a non-exhaustive list of other examples of what it can look like to love our neighbors in public through advocacy. We're not going to practice together. I thought we might, but I'm simply going to offer you this slide as an opportunity for you to practice this later. Maybe you can make a commitment to yourself to try this afternoon after we get off this call. But one form of advocacy I want to commend to you today is calling Congress, calling your member of Congress. This is something that I have trained hundreds of people in and have helped hundreds of people do. Most of the time, this feels like a black box to a lot of people who have never done it before. And most of the time after I go through this exercise with them, they say, that was so empowering. The people I talked to were so nice. I didn't have to be an expert. I just had to share my heart and my story. So for what it's worth, yeah, great. Thanks, Steve, for putting that link in the chat to help you find your representative. For what it's worth, if you're feeling like you want to engage in advocacy in some way, but you're not sure where to start, I would offer this as a starting point. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by the prospect of doing this, I hope that what I just shared can encourage you. And if you feel the opposite, if you feel cynical about doing this kind of thing, like, oh, what good is that going to do? I hang up the phone and then what? I'll share with you just really briefly what actually happens to your phone call when you hang up. So I asked this question of a congressional staffer years ago after I met in their office. I said, what happens next? Does the senator, because it was my senator's office, is she even going to know we were here? She couldn't make the meeting. And he kindly explained to me their process. He said that they have a spreadsheet. At the time it was a spreadsheet, maybe it's more formalized now, I don't know. They have a program where they input every piece of communication that they get from constituents, and they weight it based on how much effort it took that constituent to communicate that to the office. So a form email that you just have to click send to submit is going to get like 1 point, but a phone call might get 3 points because you had to pick up the phone and dial a number. A handwritten letter might get 4 or 5 because you had to write it out. You had to address it, lick it, put a stamp on it, drop it in the mail. In-person meetings, like the one I was at when I asked this question, get the most points because it takes a lot of effort to take time out of your day and visit an office. And all of those points get tabulated and communicated to the member of Congress once a week, once a month, whatever the office's rhythm is. And it's delivered, it's broken down by issue. So if environment or climate change has a high point value, week over week, month over month, for enough time, that's going to send a signal to the member of Congress that, hey, this is something that my constituents care enough about to keep communicating to me in meaningful ways. Maybe I should allocate some of my staff time to this issue. And that's going to give them the confidence to say, hey, legislative assistant, why don't you go find some pieces of legislation that I can consider co-sponsoring? Or why don't you go work with another office to try to draft a piece of legislation to address this issue? It doesn't get lost in the void. It gets recorded and it gets communicated to our members of Congress. I continue to believe wholeheartedly that even in the world of Citizens United and unlimited corporate money in politics, if citizens called their members of Congress, wrote letters to their members of Congress, met with their members of Congress regularly and consistently about things that mattered to them, it would change everything. I believe that. If we did this every day by the millions of us, it would change everything. So maybe you can consider being one of those millions today and trying this today. So that's my encouragement to you. Maybe you take a screenshot of this. Maybe you take your phone out and you take a picture of this slide. I have a script there that you can read verbatim if you want to. Yeah, great. Thank you, Steve, for putting in the chat. There's the script. But we're not going to do this together because I want to make sure there's time for discussion. So with that, I need to include my shameless plug for my own book that I published a year ago, which includes this as well as a lot of other opportunities for you to take action. It's called Following Jesus in a Warming World. You can find that wherever you get your books. And there's my contact info if you want to chat about this more. So with that, I will end and eagerly await interaction with my colleagues.
Oh, okay. So, hi, I'm Deborah, and I was asked to respond first. So that's why I jumped in. Kyle, you're awesome. Every time I sit at your feet, I learn so much, and I always feel galvanized and inspired. So thank you for that. Even though I've read and endorsed and love your book and highly recommend it, it's just so good to hear you saying all these things. So as I was sitting there, I had a number of things that kept coming to mind. And one of them was the way that in 2016, I think a lot of us realized that citizenship is going to have to mean a lot more than just voting. And many of us were sort of complacent and not used to that idea. So now we are trying to figure out what citizenship means. And all the things you said about advocacy are such an important part of that. You know, as far as voting, I really appreciate what Rebecca Solnit says about voting. And I think it's very important for religious people, Christians, to understand voting the way she understands it, which is, she says, voting is not a Valentine, it's a chess move. And in an election year where a lot of people are just like, well, I don't like anybody, fine. It's not about you loving them. And it's also not a virtue test. I think this is really important for Christians and religious people too, to not feel like they have to, that their vote is some signal of perfect virtue on their part or on the part of these candidates. It's a chess move. Look, it's a system of power. Make your chess move. I think that's very freeing and it's very realistic. And honestly, we could argue it's kind of Calvinistic, right? Like nothing is going to be perfect. So we have a citizenship problem. But I wonder if people are thinking now we also have an information problem. we have an information literacy problem. How do you know what to advocate for? How do you even pay attention to all this policy stuff? Now, a lot of this I was familiar with, Kyle, because I've had my nose in all this for about 7 years now too. But most people do not live in the land of wonky policy, right? So how are you even going to know? The headlines don't necessarily give you a good deep dive into this policy. So our news media, I think, is really part of the problem. Even the very best news media, it's not necessarily good citizen information. It's more, you know, as we all know, it's more about clicks and attention and drama. So I think citizenship now also includes curating your information flow so that you are in some ways in part of these wonky information flows. And one really good way to do that is to sign up for some kind of advocacy group. And I would recommend Creation Justice Ministries or Third Act Faith if you're over 60, because there are people out there, including people of faith, who will do that kind of wonky policy analysis for you and help you learn how to do it and help you learn where the sources are so that you can feel more confident becoming an advocate. The really interesting conversations about what's going on, especially in the policy area, are not happening at the news headline level necessarily. They're happening in these wonkier spaces. And so you can certainly enter those spaces, but there are also organizations that do that for us. So I've just been really grateful in the past little while as I try to think, how am I a citizen now? For these people who do that communication. They read the wonky, you know, proposed legislation or whatever. And the other thing I would say is, if we don't, as Christians, if we don't kind of get over our over-individualizing, over-spiritualizing compartmentalization of our faith, and if we don't say it's part of our faith to do this citizenship work as best we can, then we have a power problem. Because what happens then is that the current powers and principalities just keep on doing what they're doing, and we don't have any pressure against that. So, you know, opting out is not a signal of virtue, really. It's a signal of letting the powers and principalities win. And that's what keeps me involved in this, is this sense that if I don't, I'm actually kind of being complacent with the way things are, which might be okay for me, but they're not okay for a lot of people. And they probably won't be okay for me unless I put that pressure on. So even though, you know, policy wonkiness and advocacy is like not my sweet spot at all. Look, I'm a literature professor, you know. Even so, I am learning that it is part of, as you say, Kyle, Christian discipleship. So thank you.
I can go next. Thank you so much, Kyle, for that presentation. I really especially appreciated the sort of historical background you gave and kind of denaturalizing the way things are now, and that the way things are now is not the way they've always been or always have to be. I want to think a little bit about like hope and hopelessness in this work, because I think I want to give voice to the hopelessness about this that a lot of people my age and younger especially, but not only, feel about climate change, and the sense of sort of growing up into a world that was already so far down the wrong path. And then also the ways that climate is connected to, you know, immigration policy that's going in the wrong direction, and military spending that causes massive amounts of fossil fuel emission that is always going in the wrong direction, and the way that it feels like these systems of power are so totalizing and complete. And then also I've been thinking a little bit about how some theologians even caution against too much hope, because hope can result in like a justifying justifying present suffering for the sake of future imagined, you know, better situation. So I want to give voice to that hopelessness and ask a little bit like, how do you think about you know, getting through that kind of cloud of hopelessness? But I also think I've found a lot of not hope, but comfort and resolve in the way that in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul does not say that hope is as important as love, and he does not say that you need hope in order to love. And so I think the way that you framed this advocacy as an expression of love and not of hope is maybe one response to that like crushing sense of hopelessness that can happen around this issue, and that it's actually we're actually called to do this public work of love that you're talking about, even if it doesn't look like we're going to win. And so that was a little bit about just hope and hopelessness, and that your presentation brought up for me.
Thanks, Josh. Just really quickly, I'd love to respond to that hope question. I think it's huge. I get the question a lot, like, what gives you hope? And I've really come to resent that question, because it feels like people are like, oh, okay, yeah, things are bad, but make me feel good before you finish your presentation in the last 5 minutes, right? Like, and so I really appreciate you giving voice to that hopelessness. Something I have encountered in writers like Soong-Chan Rah and others who write about lament and hope and the relationship between lament and hope is how communal hope is. I think, to Deb's point, we are such a atomized, individualistic society that even our imaginations around what hope can be are individualistic, right? Like, hope can only live inside my own head or my own heart. And I think that's one of the gifts that the church has to offer the world, is a communal sense of hope, because I cannot have hope all the time. This is too difficult. The work is too big. It's too hard. But if I'm in a community of believers who are trying to love God and love their neighbor in this way, then I don't have to muster up feelings of hope all of the time, because when I'm feeling hopeless, Deborah can hope for me. Tom can hope for me. The institution of the church that is looking forward toward the consummation of the new creation and holding tight to God's good promises, that can hold hope for me. And I think even the question of hope feels agonizing for some people, because it's so often framed individualistically, and it's really hard for me to muster hope sometimes. But if I'm a part of a community and an institution that can hope together, then when I can't hope, others can hope for me. And then maybe when they can't hope, I can hope for them. Yeah, I think that even the way we think about hope and talk about hope has to be communal.
Yep. Kyle, maybe if I could say just something quickly about love, and Josh too. The Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you will love with all your heart. Jesus picks up on that. The oneness of God it's not an affirmation of monotheism. It's an affirmation of God's undivided heart. God is one because God's concern for the world is undivided. Now, that might lead to monotheism. I mean, it implies it. But so the key thing for me is with all your heart, the totality. And the issue for me personally, but when I see it, is the divided heart. So how do you sustain this love? And there's a hint that when we're so divided, even in our own hearts, love cannot be sustained. And the goal would be the oneness of our love, with all our mind, with all our strength. And so then my thought, at least for me, and I wonder what the rest of you think about this, is in order to do this, I have to simplify my life. And it's the hurriedness, it's the distractions, it's the consumerism that pulls our interest in a million different directions, offers us pleasure in so many different ways. And I'd have no solution to this, but what I'm seeing more is if I want to love that way, I have to simplify my life.
I just want to chime in and say thank you so much, Kyle, for your presentation today. I think in our previous colloquy, we have focused on theology and kind of grounding ways of thinking about creation. Probably we were working at a creation theology, but your presentation is really also about justice, climate justice for persons and neighbors. And so one of my questions is, can you help us think about creation as neighbor? We've tended to think about it only very much in human terms and not well. And also the other thing that you raise for me is that this notion of a public theology, which is really a deeply grounded Reformed ecclesiology, which says the church is a public institution, and the church, in its proclamation and living out of the gospel, is charged with holding governments and people with power accountable for what they're doing and how they're spending money and what they care about. But I just think that given where I grew up in the Midwest, there's just such a privatistic sense of the church and a kind of piety that sees getting your hands dirty with politics is just the wrong thing to be up to. Feels like we need to do a huge lot of work around that notion of public theology and church as public institution, which is called in the Reformed tradition to hold rulers accountable. So those two things, I just wonder if you could speak to creation as neighbor and then this kind of public ecclesiology,
Yeah,
which
that's
is a
great.
little lacking in our piety.
Thank you for that, Renee. I think that's beautifully put. I'll just share briefly some thoughts, and I'm very eager what others think. On the public theology as Reformed ecclesiology, I go back to what Deborah shared in her response about power.
Yeah.
I think we have a naivete about power, and about how power is used, how it's consolidated, and what can and can't protect us from engaging with power. This sense that opting out is somehow keeping us clean from engaging in power in ways that can corrupt us is, in fact, I would argue, an abdication of our responsibility to engage in power in righteous ways that are shaped by the gospel, right? Because, like Deborah said, if we opt out, that's not, keeping us pure. All that's doing is allowing the status quo to continue to benefit from the status quo, and the status quo loves silence and inaction and apathy, right? Like, the status quo of injustice, the powers and the principalities love nothing more than for Christians to be apathetic and cynical and naive about power, right? Because as long as we're naive about power, then they get to have it all. So, and to your question about creation as neighbor, absolutely. I love that. And I've written sometimes and cautiously, always cautiously, about kinship. I say cautiously because there are indigenous traditions that have been writing and thinking about this for millennia, right? And entire peoples who are shaped by the understanding of creation as neighbor, all of creation as neighbor. And I want to learn more from them. I want to learn more from that. And I think the church has a lot to learn if we could humble ourselves and put ourselves under the instruction of those ways of being in the world, and learning more about what it could look like for the church to understand itself in a relationship of kinship with all of creation and as all of creation as a neighbor. But I'm eager what others think of that.
And we're starting to have others raising electronic hands, or at least one other. Robin Saddam, would you go ahead and unmute and share with us?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for doing this series, and I'm thrilled. I come to you as your RCA rep on the Creation Justice Ministries board, soon to be joined by Dan Carlson. So he'll be at our May board meeting in Washington. On the point of advocacy, I wanted to help you think of a couple of avenues in which to approach it. Certainly, Creation Justice Ministries, Interfaith Power and Light, there's some wonderful organizations. I also try to look at it on 3 levels: federal, state, and local. And with the federal level, I highly recommend Citizens Climate Lobby, which somebody already put in the chat. There is one for every state, and then within each state, there are chapters locally. So for me here in Franklin Township outside of New Brunswick, there's a Princeton chapter and there's a Raritan Valley chapter. They only follow federal legislation, but they keep you posted on the key issues that they are working on. They have the depth on those issues, and they're already mounting people on those issues, so you can add your voice to that, which is really helpful. On the state level, I encourage you to find your own state chapter of the League of Conservation Voters. They work on state level issues. And for a lot of us, those are the ones that have the most direct impact on how we live. And the League of Conservation Voters will have the key issues they're working on, what their goals are. They've got good people working at the State House representing issues, and they're always happy to have your voice as part of that. And locally, I encourage your churches to develop a relationship with either your local sustainable X township or your environmental commission. Your environmental commission have a voice on policy in your municipality. They don't necessarily have authority, but they have a voice, and the council has to listen to them. I serve on the Franklin Township Environmental Commission, and some towns have also either a green team or a sustainable Franklin, for example. They tend to do more projects, where the Environmental Commission tends to react to development plans and work on policy. So it helps to break this down for me into not level of impact, but point of impact, federal, state, or local. And to the extent that your church has strong feelings on an issue, figure out where that point of leverage is and go to the right organization to help you be heard. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you for adding to our resource lists here. John Norton, go ahead and unmute.
Yes, I just wanted to react with a reaction that I had to what I felt was a downplaying of hope to me, the first act of God in any Christian's heart is placing hope within us. And this whole presentation has been like God shoving into my heart once more, especially how you're opening up and listing of the 60s this happened, and in the 70s this happened, and they all were Republicans. That really shook me. It fills me with all kinds of hope. And to me, the fact that I want to see things happen, Jesus wanted to see things happen too, and look what happened to him. So I just hope you go light on the downplaying of hope, because for me, hope is an energizer. It's where things start, and that's my comment. I thought this has been a wonderful presentation, and like I say, it's been an energizer for me. So thank all of you for that.
Thanks, John. I'm glad.
You bet.
I can just respond briefly about hope. Thank you, John, for that context, because you're totally right that hope can be a massively positive force for fighting for change and living out our Christian lives. I just wanted to bring attention to the fact that I think there's a lot of people who aren't there right now when it comes to climate issues. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing for them to do, or there's no place for them in, fighting for the kind of climate legislation that Kyle is talking about. So I wasn't trying to exclude hope. I just think that we also don't want to exclude those who don't feel a lot of hope right now. So just to clarify my comments there, but thank you.
I'll just add to it that Al Gore's climate project, which is really active in the Hudson Valley where I live, does very thorough presentations. I'm sure you can find somebody to come to the local church. But what I appreciate about their work is that they do measurable, hopeful signs. So how much they actually are tracking CO outputs and how it's affecting the climate. And if this many people add solar energy to their house, it reduces by that much. So it's really also because I meet a lot of people who think our tiny inputs aren't going to make a difference. I love your focus on advocacy, but tiny inputs do make a difference because they add up to something. So the Al Gore's climate project, which is nationwide doing its work, does a really great job of tracking tiny moments where we can celebrate that we're doing better.
I don't see any other hands at the moment. Does anybody else want to chime in with something? Do we have a couple of final thoughts?
Oh, I've just been thinking with Josh about we need some new hymns. We need some new hymns. I want to write some new hymns with people. So I want to have a creation love hymn writing festival.
Renee, are you familiar with the Climate Vigil album by Porter's Gate?
I am not.
Oh, they've already had that idea and they produced an amazing album.
Yeah?
Called Climate Vigil. The group is called
Wonderful.
Porter's Gate, and you can find it online.
Wonderful.
And they've done marvelous work. And there's also a UK group called Ecology that has
That one I have known about.
Yeah.
Great.
Climate Vigil's great.
So now we just have to get churches singing them.
I would say too that for me, going deeper into information about both what's scary about climate futures, but also what's happening has been really encouraging. And I tell young people this too, because as you say, Josh, young people feel a lot of hopelessness, but they don't always know a lot. So I say, get informed, deeper dive, not just the headlines, because if you get informed, you will start to see not only all the amazing things that are happening, but the amazing people that are doing them. You will not feel so alone. You will find some people, and it's as you say, Kyle, it's in community and in action that we actually manufacture hope. You know, hope comes from God, but we get it going in community and by working on things together. So a kind of vague malaise that young people feel for many reasons, economic reasons, political reasons, climate change reasons. Action helps a lot. So I think Kyle's instructions and wisdom about advocacy are, in a way, a path to hope.
And I'll just throw in, you know, the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada will be gathering this summer in July 14th through 16th in Atlanta. But a lot of the presentations and programs will be online. So go to hymnsociety.org and you can find out more about that. You don't have to go to Atlanta, though. I'll tell you, it's loads of fun to just be there and sing. As my wife used to say, you go and for 3 or 4 days, somebody else does all the cooking for you, and all you have to do is go to things and sing and have a good time. Robin Saddam, go ahead and unmute and share.
I just wanted to add to your list of hopeful things. I apologize if you've mentioned this earlier, but Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who is a Christian and
Oh,
professor
yeah.
at Texas Tech, she has a great weekly newsletter, and she starts out with the good news. And it's encouraging, it keeps you going. And then she'll follow with the not so good news. And she has an amazing TED Talk about how to get people talking about climate change. Her point is communicating. And she does a nice job, and she's right out front and says, I'm a Christian. This is why I do this. But if you need a little pipeline of good news, subscribe to her newsletter. It's free, and it's short, and it can be upbeat.
I'll plug Deborah's newsletter too. Deborah puts out a newsletter, seriously, and she does a great job of including things that give her hope and that are hopeful, and good news too. So that's another great newsletter.
And you're gonna put the URL for that in the chat, right, Kyle? Because we've now got a huge list of resources that
I'm on it.
for this particular program, there will be attached to the page where you'll find the recording a resource list once Steve and I get it together after this meeting, mostly me, just so Steve doesn't panic.
Thank you, Kyle. I appreciate that. My way of thinking about my newsletter is I read all the newsletters, so you don't have to.
Thank you, Deborah. It's a service.
Just another service I provide.
One final thought I had was, Deborah, when you were talking about how it can feel overwhelming for people not in the policy space to know how to engage in advocacy. That's something I hear a lot. I think part of the answer is yes, get informed, pay attention to organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby and others that are doing that work for you. And at the same time, as you do that work, don't let that stop you from engaging now, because the most important thing I think that you can do is not have a bill number that you're telling your member of Congress to support. It's not having the summary for policymakers from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change memorized, right? Like you don't have to be the expert before you can start engaging in advocacy. It's enough to just be a citizen and to have a story about why you care and why it matters to you, because they work for you, right? Believe it or not, Congress works for us, and our local leaders work for us, and our state leaders work for us, and it's our job to tell them how we want them to do their job on our behalf. And that doesn't always have to include really specific asks. It can be enough to simply say, this is something that matters a lot to me, here's why, and I really want you to focus on it.
Well, thank you, everyone. Folks who've been here listening and following along and checking out the bibliography that's been posted at nbts.edu and sharing with all of us in all these, and especially for our presenters who've been here for this project that's now gone on for a year and a half, is it, Renee? Okay. And so thank you all. I hope you have a great afternoon. You'll get a follow-up letter tomorrow if you're one of the participants. And as I say, things will get posted up to nbts.edu at this link, and you'll be able to find them and keep doing work and keep being in dialogue and keep moving this discussion forward. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.